So what I want to talk to you about today is a subject that I briefly touched on when I spoke at the first Fairhaven Wind Forum just a year ago regarding the placement of the turbines in Fairhaven. One of the things I'd like you to know is just a piece of background is that the turbines in Fairhaven, they're not the largest wind farm you'll find anywhere. This is just two 1.5 megawatt turbines, but what makes them somewhat unique is the number of people who live within close range of these turbines. You've heard some numbers kicked around today of 1.5 kilometers, 2 kilometers, and so forth. So I did a little bit of rough math, and there are probably about 6,000 people living within a 2-kilometer radius, and I will show you some information about that. Now, I really have only two very simple ideas that I want to suggest to you today. And they're both regarding the situation with the turbine sightings and human rights. And the first idea is very simple, and that is that the idea of informed consent, which is a fundamental ethical principle for all medical research, and it has been ensconced in many, many institutions, including the World Health Organization, the World Health Association, the United Nations. It's in the Geneva Convention, the Helsinki Declaration. These are well understood, but they are always and only applied to one situation, medical research. And the idea that I want to convey to you today is that it doesn't belong to simply medical research. We have the right to be free of unwarranted experimentation. We have the right to be free of being guinea pigs. The other idea that I want to convey to you is that the health difficulties with wind turbines is more than dangerous enough to be considered seriously in the context of fundamental human rights. Those are the two ideas that I want to talk to you about today. So, what are human rights? Human rights belong to all human beings simply by virtue of the fact that they are human. They are non-discriminatory. You only need to be human, and they apply to you. They are inalienable, and I think this is something that really bears emphasis. You cannot vote away human rights. You cannot create compliance regulations that deprive people of human rights. If you do so, you are violating their human rights. And finally, they don't disappear with political boundaries. They don't disappear. Human rights don't disappear, for example, if we have a right to not be tortured, even in war. That has been recognized as a fundamental human right of anyone involved in the war in the Geneva Convention. So those are the kinds of topics that and here are just a few of the most widely and fundamentally recognized human rights. We have a right to life, a right to freedom from torture, the integrity of our bodies, or what is sometimes called the inviolability of our bodies. And finally, this right to health, which was mentioned by Carmen Krogh earlier today. This is very important. It's the idea, the fundamental idea that underlies all of our care for the environment. There's an irony here because the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, all of these things are a recognition that we all have a right to clean air and clean water because they are fundamental and they are essential to the highest attainable human health. But now look at these human rights. If we have these human rights, do we not also have the right to be free from unwarranted experimentation on human subjects that stem from these human rights? That's a very simple idea, and that's the opinion that I have formed about what's going on here. Now, I want to talk to you about one of the most fundamental sets of ethical guidelines that have been developed in modern history. It's called the Nuremberg Code. The Nuremberg Code is a series of ethical guidelines, the very first one of which is something called voluntary or informed consent. Okay? It also embodies the principle of something else that I want to tell you about, respect for persons, and finally this idea of social justice and what is right and wrong. This set of guidelines was created by the American Military Tribunal to try the doctors who were members of the Nazi regime that conducted unwarranted experimentation, horrific experimentation, on Nazi prisoners of the concentration camps. Okay? And that trial took place in 1947, 2 years after the war ended. But what I want to do today is take you back just a little bit and tell you about two other related historical events that have a direct bearing on how this doctrine came to be, because it has a direct relationship to what's going on with the turbines today. The first story that I want to tell you about is this thing called the Lubeck catastrophe. The Lubeck catastrophe happened in 1931. This is about 2 years before the Nazis came to power. And at that time, the government was a democratically elected government called the Weimar Republic. And a vaccine called the BCG vaccine had been developed to prevent tuberculosis. Now, you have to understand that tuberculosis was the killer. If you're having a history exam and you didn't know what somebody died from, you could guess tuberculosis and be right about 75% of the time. So this was an incredibly important discovery, this idea that you could have a vaccine that would actually protect people from tuberculosis. But what happened? When you get a virus, a live virus, it has to go through a process of weakening called attenuation. If you weaken it too much, it doesn't protect you. If you don't weaken it enough, then it can kill you. And in this case, they didn't test it first. They didn't test it on animals. So what happened is 72 children of the 252 that were inoculated died from tuberculosis or related complications. And when that happened, a series of regulations were passed in Weimar, Germany, that said from now on, before you give anybody a vaccine, you have to test it on animals and make sure it's safe first. You see, it's a good idea. And then they said, and not only that, when you're going to give somebody a vaccine, you have to tell them that there is a serious danger. There's a risk that they could be harmed by it. This is the central idea of informed consent. So when the Nazis came to power in 1933, okay, there were regulations that looked very much like our own regulations, all of which are based upon the Nuremberg Code. And the first thing that the Nazis did in this regard is they passed a series of laws that said it was cruel to experiment on animals. It was cruel to experiment on animals. Who did that leave? Only people. So in 1947, when the doctor's trial took place, the 23 defendants, including Karl Brandt, who was considered to be the chief medical sponsor of these experiments, argued that what they were doing was not against the law. And it was true. Now, let me just tell you very briefly about the Tuskegee experiment, because I'm going to bring it right back to the Nuremberg trials in just a moment. This man is an employee of the federal government in 1932 as part of something that came to be known as the Tuskegee syphilis experiments. This was a series of experiments that where the Public Health Service of the United States, the forerunner to what we now call Health and Human Services, lied to a group of rural black farmers and told them that they were going to get free medical care if they participated in this study. They lied to them. There was no informed consent. And they believed that they were getting health care. They believed that their health was being protected by their participation in the study. And what was the result? 500 men were allowed to mature through all the stages of syphilis, and by the time the experiment was over, all but 27 of them were dead from syphilis or the related complications of syphilis. And this was a study that was conducted by the United States Public Health Service in 1932. So in 1937, when the experiment was still going on, and the Nazis said, and you do these kinds of experiments in the United States as well, it was absolutely true. Because this experiment, among others, were ongoing. Now, this is all of the places where the Nuremberg Code has since been adopted. But when do you think these things were adopted? When do you think all of these organizations, the United Nations International Covenant, the basis of international guidelines for biomedical research involving human subjects, World Health Organization, Code of Federal Regulations, the United States Department of Health and Human Services, all of these have embraced the Nuremberg Code. But when? Was it in 1947 when it was first drafted? Absolutely not. You're going to have to wait to hear the rest of the story about the Tuskegee experiment. This is the Nuremberg Code. And what does the Nuremberg Code say? Rule number 1. This is a very shortened version of it, but it's online. You can download this from the Department of Health and Human Services online today. It's still there. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. And what makes it voluntary? It's voluntary when it's informed and when you understand what the risks are, and this is very, very important, when you understand what the benefits of the experiment are. Because if you're not given a valid and accurate description of the benefits, it's just as bad as if you're not told about what the risks are, because you are taking those risks unnecessarily. Now, I'm not going to go through all of these, but I want to call your attention to just one or two others. And I want to especially call your attention to number 7, because I think this is directly relevant to the ethical questions around siting turbines. Protect the experimental subject against even the remote possibility of injury, disability, or death. Now, this does not say that it has to be a medical or a scientific certainty in order for you to have to be informed that there is risk. And it has to be done before you are asked to take that risk. And I know that this room is probably half full of people who are suffering from ill health effects from turbines that they were not told about. That's what the Nuremberg Code says. And I don't think that it matters whether it's a medical experiment, whether it is a scientific experiment, whether it is an industrial experiment. You see, for 2,500 years, we lived with do no harm. But the reality is that do no harm was crafted by Hippocrates when he knew there was a relationship of trust between a patient and their doctor. This is no longer that relationship. If it's experimentation, then the result that they're after is the results of the experiment, not the health of the patient. And that's why the only thing that matters to make it, in my opinion, the only thing that makes this matter as a set of ethical guidelines is whether or not you are putting people at risk of their health. And there's a reasonable reason to think that they may suffer harm. This is a comment that was written by Evelyn Schuster, who is a bioethicist. It appeared on the 50th anniversary of the Nuremberg Code. And basically, she wanted to review this, and she did so in the New England Journal of Medicine. Informed consent, the core of the Nuremberg Code, has rightly been viewed as the protection of subjects' human rights. The key contribution of Nuremberg was to merge Hippocratic ethics and the protection of human rights in a single code.